Here's the thing nobody warns you about when you decide to reread a book in another language. You think you're just revisiting the same story. You already know it. You're not. Sometimes you're reading a completely different book. And apparently, I decided that wasn't difficult enough, so I did something mildly unhinged and read The Lord of the Rings in Hebrew. Not because my life is stable and well balanced enough to support niche literary experiments. It's the polar opposite. This is exactly the kind of thing you do when your brain decides normal hobbies aren't intellectually inconvenient enough, to quote someone I know. And what stuck with me the most wasn't just how different it is, or felt. I wasn't reading one Hebrew version. I was reading two completely different versions of Tolkien. Because Hebrew readers have been having their own little translation civil war for decades. So let's talk about it. And let's talk about these books. If you've only ever read Tolkien in English, or maybe one translated edition, it's easy to assume that translation is straightforward. You take one word in one language, move it into another. Keep the meaning intact, job done. That's adorable. That is not how it works. With Tolkien especially, translation becomes something much stranger because his writing isn't just storytelling, it's architectural. Every name matters, every rhythm, every sentence structure, everything's built in this deliberate historical texture. He wasn't just writing fantasy, he was building a linguistic mythology. Yes, we're going to be using pretentious words in this, and I'm sorry. So when you translate Tolkien, you're not just translating a plot. You've got atmosphere, cadence, mythology, history, invented everything, languages, and about 17 layers of philosophy. Which is why Hebrew ended up with two major translations when it came to Lord of the Rings. And honestly, they feel like completely different philosophies of what Tolkien should be. Which, it's strange, actually. It's strange to read because of that. The first major translation came out between 1979 and 1980, and this version has an interesting reputation. Amongst a lot of Hebrew readers, it's considered beautiful. It's very poetic, literary. My notes here say almost mythic in tone. It uses elevated, often biblical or high Hebrew. And when I say elevated, I mean this version occasionally feels like someone handed Tolkien to an old Torah prophet and said, make it dramatic. There's this real sense of grandeur to it. The language has a lot of weight. It feels very ancient, very ceremonial. Like Middle Earth has somehow drifted through Jewish literary history and emerged wrapped in scripture. And sometimes it absolutely works. There are moments when reading that text felt amazing. It felt epic. Like the story had become its own oral legend passed down from generations. It gives parts of Tolkien this strange, majestic gravity that honestly fitted better than I expected. But, and there's always a but, sometimes the same kind of poetic ambitions become a lot. And I mean a lot. A little too ornate, a little too determined to remind you that this is serious literature. There are passages where the writing becomes so flowery, it feels less like Tolkien and more like a translator is politely trying to out-Tolkien Tolkien, which is a very bold choice. And there's a lot of very famous debates and discussions about this version. And people are still arguing about it. One of them is the translation of elves. Instead of a direct equivalent, the original version renders them the children of Lilith, which is definitely an interesting choice. For those really unfamiliar, Lilith is deeply rooted in Jewish folklore and later mystical traditions. Mysterious, dark, often associated with the night, danger, rebellion, exile, the first wife of Adam. incredible mythology. Absolutely not what most readers picture when they think of noble Tolkien elves. It's one of those translation choices that is undeniably creative, but also extremely weird. It gives the elves this completely different mythological framework. Suddenly they're carrying cultural associations Tolkien never intended. It's not remote, it's interesting. I kind of like the choice. It changes the tone, but it's not remotely faithful. It changes the emotional texture of the world. You stop seeing Rivendell and you start seeing something stranger, something more folkloric and unsettling, and what might, well, I think it's artistically valid, but it's really not Tolkien. But I kind of love it. Then came the newer revised Hebrew editions, and this is where things change. A lot. These versions work much more directly from Tolkien's English. The goal is clearer. They are far more accurate, consistent, and even working within Tolkien's very specific naming conventions, which matters, because Tolkien cared obsessively about names. This is a man who would absolutely haunt your house over incorrect etymology. The revised version restores a lot of the structural precision. The elves are elves again, which I appreciate. Partly because it does go much closer to Tolkien's intentions, and partly because, I no longer have to mentally process Galadriel sounding like she'd wandered in from from apocalyptic folklore. It also corrects some inconsistencies and a lot of errors from the early translations. Names are handled more systematically. Reference lines much clearer. The internal logic of Middle-earth feels really intact, and practically speaking is a lot easier to read. The Hebrew is more modern, more accessible, and far more cohesive. If you're reading the trilogy in Hebrew for the first time, this is almost certainly the version I'd recommend, especially because it's widely available in a single volume edition, which is convenient. If, like me, your bookshelf's already at the point where there's more hardbacks that could probably trigger complete and utter structural collapse and you'll get buried by your books. This newer translation flows, it moves, you can settle into it. And for a story as dense as Tolkien's, the readability matters a lot. But here's the thing for me, because accuracy isn't everything. This is the weird paradox I keep running into while reading translated works. Revised translation is technically better. I believe that. It's clearer, it's more faithful, it's more consistent, it respects the linguistic intentions. Yet, sometimes it loses something. That older translation, all of its weirdness and occasional chaos, has texture, atmosphere, a kind of very dramatic literary personality. The revised version can occasionally feel flattened by comparison. Not wrong, just safer. It delivers Tolkien more clearly, but sometimes feels less magical. And I think that's the dilemma of any person doing translation work. Do you preserve the exact meaning, or do you preserve the emotional resonance, even if it means taking risks? There is no easy answer to that. And honestly, reading both back to back made me appreciate how impossible translation really is. You're always losing something. The question is simple. What loss are you willing to accept? And this is a part I'm just going to put in kind of footnote here, but I thought I'd notice mostly technical differences. Choices, syntax, names, all of that stuff. That kind of thing when you read it. What actually happens with Stranger, Middle-earth feels culturally relocated. Not entirely, but it does change the emotional atmosphere. Reading Tolkien in Hebrew adds this completely different resonance, to use another pretentious word, to the text. Hebrew carries historical and literary weight that subtly transforms the experience. Certain descriptions feel older, sharper, almost elemental. The language can give this incredible gravity. And, anything detailed, dealing with kingship, memory, loss, exiles, whatever. Themes Tolkien was obsessed with. In Hebrew, those themes sometimes land differently, sometimes much harder. It's difficult to explain unless you read across different languages, but the emotional architecture of the book changes. The same story suddenly casts different shadows. And that's what kind of stuck with my brain. Not whether one version was objectively better, but how translation reveals different dimensions to the same work. If I had a choice, the newer revised translation. I will say that, which version wins? It's very comfortable to read, it's more cohesive, more readable, more aligned with actual intentions. And if I ever reread Lord of the Rings in Hebrew again, that'll probably be the version I reach for. But I'm glad that I read both, because the original translation, strange choices and all, has a really nice charm to it. It feels older. It feels like a moment in history, literal history, not literary, literal. A translator wrestling with Tolkien and deciding, no, actually, I'm going to interpret this through a very specific Hebrew lens. Objectively, sometimes questionable. Artistically, I kind of love it. And maybe that's why it stuck with me the most. Translation isn't just conversion, it's interpretation, it's criticism, it's adaptation. Sometimes it even argues with itself. Reading Tolkien in Hebrew reminds me that every translated book is really two books, the one the author wrote and the one the translator rebuilt. And somewhere in between those versions, you'll find entirely new ways to experience stories you already knew, which is honestly why I keep doing these weird experiments, because every now and then they remind me that great books aren't fixed objects. They're living things, changing every time they cross a new language border. And apparently sometimes, when they cross into Hebrew, elves briefly become associated with Lilith, which I'm still not fully recovered from, on an emotional level, because that was such a strange choice. But anyway, I'll leave this here. I'm Dove James. If you like this and you want to support this channel, check out Patreon and Substack and channel memberships. But also you can leave a comment. Tell me what you think. I want to know. Get involved. And I'll leave it here. See you in the next one.